Compared with solved cases, only one variable was found to be similar in predicting body disposal patterns, namely, when the victim is a prostitute pre-crime phase. Further, several other variables throughout the entire criminal event that were shown to be significant predictors in solved cases did not appear to be true for unsolved cases. This suggests that there are other factors at play when it comes to predicting body disposal patterns between offenders who were caught and those who got away. Discussion. An examination of each of the crime phases has produced interesting results, notably,
sometimes murder, the answer come back to crime scene.
I found the abraca. I just grabbed the abraca.
I got a character.
For the first time.
I forgot what they call y'all Pokemon. The cats.
I have no idea.
Yeah, the answer of like to come back to the crime scene too. So,
I didn't understand nothing she just said. There was a whole bunch of people.
Snapshots of the people that's at the crime scene. Yeah, they like to see their work sometimes.
That's the thing.
And we get that out of question.
I don't even know what the fuck they talking about.
Inconspicuous character.
What I'm finna do is I'm finna send all this shit to court. Yeah, it's open already, but I don't know how.
These variables represented the most value in predicting body disposal patterns for solved SH cases. In particular, findings showed that when the victim's body was injured, or if the offender tried to destroy or remove it, it was more likely that the offender
It's the highest Pokemon.
The presence of these forensic awareness behaviors suggests that investigators may be searching for a sadistic type offender. Beauregard and Crew, 2002. Real et al. 2006.
Leave from
Previous research has shown that when the offender moved the body after killing the victim, it increased the risk of detection, resulting in a shorter time for law enforcement to recover the body. Beauregard and Martineau, 2016. When an offender decides to move the victim's body, he may be exposed to potential eyewitnesses in the area or risk leaving forensic evidence during the move. However, research has also shown that when the victim's body was concealed, it took longer for law enforcement to recover the body. Beauregard and Martineau, 2014. Thus, since moving a body increases the risk of detection, this suggests that the offender had made additional rational decisions to conceal the body or destroy forensic evidence once he has moved it. Another interesting finding was that when the victim's body was found lying face down, it was more likely to have been moved. This suggests a sense of a personal relationship between the victim and the offender, in which the victim is seen as an object to be discarded. Z. Cantor and Young, 2012. Conversely, expressive offenders were more likely to manually strangle their victims and then leave their body at the crime scene. Usually, the offender is positioned on top of the victim while he strangled her thus. Her body would be lying face up. For example, in the expressive/instrumental typology study by Goodwill et al., 2014, of Serbian homicide cases, the authors found that expressive offenders use strangulation to kill their victims, often knew their victim, and often left her at the crime scene. Therefore, it made sense that when the victim's body was found lying face down, it was more than likely to have been moved from somewhere else. Previous research on crime locations found that 1/3 of SH occurred in the victim's home. Langevin et al., 1988. Similarly, the disorganized offender often knew the victim, attacked the victim at the front, and leaves the body at the crime scene. Ressler et al., 1980. Conversely, this study results show the fact that the victim's body was found in the residence did not predict whether the body was moved post-SH. Thus, it is imperative to carefully scrutinize the utility of SH typologies, such as the FBI-organized/disorganized dichotomy, which mainly focused on crime and post-crime phase factors. In fact, for Beauregard and Prue, 2002, demonstrated that when pre-crime variables were analyzed, several significant differences were found within the FBI's organized/disorganized pathway. This study's result echoes the importance of considering factors from not only one phase of the crime commission process, but rather the entirety of the criminal event. Furthermore, the victim's characteristics seems to play a significant role in predicting body disposal patterns in SH cases. In particular, when the victim is a prostitute, the offender is most likely to move her body after completing his crime. Research has shown that prostitutes represented the highest victimization rates among women. Brewer et al., 2006, and topped the homicide charts for riskiest line of work, Lohman, 2000. Due to the criminalization and the stigma of prostitution, these women were forced to work in environments that are dangerous, out of sight, and hidden from the general public. Sanders and Sherrod, 2016. This type of working environment perpetuates violence against prostitutes, given that there are no capable guardians around to witness the crime. Thus, prostitution is an indicator of what has been termed risky lifestyle, Beauregard and Martin, 2012. And the riskier the lifestyle, the more likely they become an easier target for the offender. Furthermore, the transient nature of some prostitutes may exacerbate their risky lifestyle. Due to the criminalization of prostitution, these women are forced to move from one location to another whenever the police came to sweep prostitution from a particular stroll. Lohman, 2000. Being highly mobile, these women become vulnerable targets for offenders, as their disappearance will not be noticed immediately. Furthermore, a study on prostitute homicides conducted by Chon and Beauregard, 2018, showed that white offenders were more likely to target strangers compared to non-white offenders. Thus, when police investigators establish that the victim is a prostitute, the next plausible task is to construe the victim-offender relationship, the one that got away. The second research question this study aimed to answer was whether the factors which influenced body disposal patterns for offenders who were apprehended, i.e. solved cases, were similar for offenders who succeeded in avoiding detection, i.e. unsolved cases. The vast majority of sex offense research has been conducted on incarcerated offenders. Albeit informative, law investigators generally do not know the identity of the offender, especially in SH cases. Trussler, 2010. To address this issue, a detection avoidance study conducted by Valemba et al., 2014, examined the difference of crime scene factors present between solved and unsolved cases in SH. Specifically, the authors found that there is indeed a difference in the offender's modus operandi between the ones who got caught and the ones who got away. Results from the current study seem to corroborate Valemba et al.'s 2014 findings. Unsolved cases model shows that the pre-crime phase has the most value in predicting body disposal patterns. Specifically, victims' characteristics better predicted whether the victim's body was moved for. Unsolved cases. On the other hand, post-crime phase behaviors, i.e., victim's body concealed, body found lying face down, offender destroy evidence, had the most predictive value in solved cases. Table 2. This difference is notable as it also supports previous research results which found that offenders who took precautions in trying to hide their identity post-crime were in fact apprehended sooner. Beauregard and Martineau, 2016. Thus, it is likely that offenders in this sample who managed to avoid detection employed different modus operandi or behaviors that allowed them to thwart police investigations. Results show that when there was evidence of stabbing, the offender is less likely to move the victim's body after killing her. Consistent with the angry type of offender, excessive violence is associated with an offender who may have known the victim and often left her body at the crime scene. Beauregard and Prue, 2002. Stab wounds often lead to excessive blood loss, i.e. exsanguination, and is the most common cause of death from stabbing. Spitz, 1993. From a rational choice point of view, the offender may decide to not move the victim after the act of stabbing, as to avoid creating more of an evidence or simply just because the offender could not stand the sight of all the blood. Moreover, the act of stabbing can also be related to the situational precipitated type of offender, who did not intend to kill their victim, but was angered by the victim's resistance, which turned into lethal violence. See Chopin and Beauregard. 2019 v. Healy et al. 2016. Thus, since the initial plan was not to kill the victim, the offender most likely did not plan on what to do with the body after the victim died, resulting in the body not being moved, or being left outdoors at the scene. Leaving behind a body, and possibly knowing the victim, these offenders should have left enough information for investigators to be identified and apprehended. Why then do these cases remain unsolved? Perhaps these offenders are what? Lemma et al. 2014, classified as lucky due to investigation errors, uncooperative witnesses, or discrepancies in the chain of custody. Recent research has shown that the skills of the investigators are equally as important in determining the resolution of an SH case. See James and Beauregard, 2018. Interestingly, the location on where the body was discovered did not predict whether the offender moved the body post-SH. This is counterintuitive in regards to rational sense, as offenders will most likely choose a secluded location like dense forests, undeveloped areas, and isolated locations to dispose of the victim's body. According to routine activity theory, Cohen and Felsen, 1979, the dumping site choice of offenders who committed serial homicides chose public outdoor locations, Morton et al., 2014, C. and Beauregard, 2018, where there are no capable guardians around to protect the offense. Moreover, choosing an outdoor dumping site meant that human remains will be exposed to environmental elements such as gravity, weather, water flow, and animal activity, Skinner and Lazenby, 1983. Exposure to these elements will cause the body to decompose and deteriorate quicker compared with a protected, i.e. indoor, crime location, resulting in the loss of potentially important evidence that could help link the offender to the victim. However, whether the body was found outdoors did not predict if the body was moved in the current study for both solved and unsolved cases. Perhaps the crime and post-crime locations were similar. That is, the offender attacked the victim outdoors and left her body at the scene. This suggests that there is an interplay of several other factors that need to be considered, rather than focusing solely on the location of body disposal sites to predict body disposal patterns. Implications for law investigations and conclusion. In terms of practical implications, the results highlight the importance of distinction between offenders who got caught and those who got away. In Chopin et al., 2019. Study. The authors found differences in behavioral methods utilized by rapists in solved and unsolved rape cases. Similarly, the current study's results show that different crime phase factors were better at predicting whether the body was moved post-SH in solved and unsolved cases. For instance, if the victim's body was concealed, lying face down, or destroyed evidence, it is most likely that the offender will be detected soon. Solved cases. Whereas, if the victim was a prostitute, or if the crime scene presented evidence of stabbing, then it may be a clue that the offender may have taken additional steps to avoid detection. Unsolved cases. By identifying which factors are present at the beginning of the investigation, law enforcement are better equipped to predict the type of offender, those who will be apprehended soon, or those who will remain elusive. Thus, appropriate resources and manpower can be determined at the onset of an investigation, ensuring sufficient dedication to particularly more difficult cases to solve. The offender's modus operandi may also provide clues as to the level of expertise, criminal experience, and the skills of the offender. For example, organized Wrestler et al. 1988, or sadistic Beauregard and crew. Offenders were most likely to conceal or move the victim's body post-SH, indicating high levels of planning prior to crime. This can also suggest that the offender has had some or a lot of experience in committing violent crimes, as he is actively concealing or moving the body to avoid detection. it is possible that the offender has had prior criminal convictions, and a possible suspect list can be started by looking through current police records. Thus, police investigators should pay attention to the presence, or lack thereof, of these behaviors when assessing the crime seen to assist in narrowing down potential suspect lists. The use of criminal event factors to deduce body disposal patterns is a tangible and effective way to discern clues as to the identity of the offender. Body disposal sites, forensic evidence left behind, and the way victim was killed are usually the first identifiable clues to investigators. In addition, the body disposal patterns identified will provide valuable information to investigators, as most lack experience in dealing with SH, Beauregard, and Martineau, 2012. Since our results show that the offender had most likely moved the body if the victim was recovered outdoors, police investigators should focus on the neighborhood surrounding the body disposal site to determine potential suspects who would be familiar with the area or who may be frequenting the site. An initial canvassing of the residents at the nearest neighborhood can help investigators uncover crucial clues or information that may lead to a potential sighting of a suspect. Furthermore, the concealment of the victim's body suggests that the offender is trying to delay or prevent discovery, or to place time and distance between themselves and the crime. Morton et al., 2014. Thus, police investigators who discovered a concealed body should take into account the extra time that has elapsed, and possibly looking at events that occurred few hours prior to the estimated time of death. The results from this study can help investigators be aware of the crime scene, victim, and offender characteristics associated with each unique body disposal pattern. This information will lead to higher accuracy and swift identification of offenders, which ensures scarce criminal justice resources are being utilized in the most cost-effective manner. Moreover, efficient investigative techniques will lead to better public safety policies. Carter and Carter, 2016, by targeting known risk factors associated with sexual homicides. Although informative, this study is not without its limitations. Our sample is derived from police data, in which constitutes the issue of the dark figure of crime. Previous research have shown that only between 1% and 5% of all homicides are classified as sexual. John and Heidi, 2008. Although these crimes are rare, the low base rate in official reports can be attributed to underestimations. Examples include improper classification of the crime due to the lack of a standardized SH definition. See Chan, 2015 for further discussions, missing persons not reported. Or misclassification by the investigator due to an absent sexual element of the crime scene. Beauregard, 2018.
Evolves.
In terms of the variable body moved, the circumstance concerning whether the body was indeed moved by the offender could not be confirmed in our dataset, unless there was a confession. Information on victimology, e.g., victim's identity, victim's occupation, can also be difficult to establish, especially when the victim is from a marginalized population. In addition, the cases in this sample ranged from 1948 to 2010, presenting a wide range of names. This may pose some challenges when considering what generational effects could be influencing the variables. For example, there were only 2,304,943 motor vehicles in Canada in 1948, compared to 20,267,982 vehicles in 2010, Statistics Canada. Thus, the criminal mobility of the offender may be attributed to the lack of vehicle availability during that era. Moreover, factors of urbanization and changes in the environmental backlog over the decades may also impact the offender's crime script. In the early 1950s, numerous lands may still have been underdeveloped, which meant isolated locations for offenders to attack unsuspecting victims. Compared to today's urban landscape, there are currently more people around, acting as capable guardians, thus making it more difficult for the offender to target victims without being seen. Cohen and Felsen, 1979. Future research should consider these generational factors and how it would affect the offender's behavior and body disposal patterns. Furthermore, substantial advancement in forensic science since the 1970s has led to significant improvements within criminal investigations. One of the greatest scientific breakthroughs, DNA typing in 1986, greatly improved the reliability of forensic investigative
I go on
techniques.
this motherfucker.
Peterson and Leggett, 2007, which allowed for higher serendipity. This could be a contributing factor in influencing the status of the cases, i.e., solved versus unsolved, in our sample. Nonetheless, majority of the cases in our sample occurred after 1992, 53%, many years since the first DNA typing technology emerged. Therefore, we believe that advancement in forensic technology will not affect our results in a meaningful way. Rational choice have contributed to the explanation of why people commit crimes. In the current study's case, even seemingly irrational crimes like sexual homicides can be explained in a rational sense. The notion that sex offenders have uncontrollable sexual urges to offend are no longer the norm within criminology academia, as more researchers move to adopt rational choice perspective to explain sexual homicides, Beauregard and Lucier, 2018. Like any other criminals, sex offenders perform rational thought analysis when carrying out their crime. Furthermore, not only are crime scripts crime-specific, e.g., burglary versus sex offense, this study has shown that crime scripts are also specific to offenders who are apprehended and those who avoided detection. It is recommended that future research investigate crime scripts on a more micro and detailed level to possibly identify script pathways between the two types of offenders. Declaration of conflicting interests. The authors declared no potential conflicts of interest with respect to the research, authorship, and/or publication of this article. Funding. The authors received no financial support for the research, authorship, and/or publication of this article. ORCID IDs. Eric Beauregard, https://orchid or /00003-1828-0890. Julian Chopin, https://orchid or /00003-4459-2530. References. Anderson N. 2014. Environmental Criminology. Evolution, Theory, and Practice. Routledge. Go to reference. Crossref. Google Scholar. Balemba S. Beauregard E. Martineau N. 2014. Getting Away with Murder. A thematic approach to solved and unsolved sexual homicides using crime scene factors. Police Practice and Research, 15, 3, 221 to 233. https://doy-org.apis.edu/1080-1080/106548. Google Scholar. Beauregard E. 2018. Lethal Outcome in Sexual Crimes. A Criminological Perspective on Sexual Homicide. In Beauregard E. Lucier P. eds. Sexual Offending. A Criminological Perspective. Pages 276 to 296. Routledge. Google Scholar. Beauregard E. Bouchard M. 2010. Cleaning Up Your Act. Forensic Awareness as a Detection Avoidance Strategy. Journal of Criminal Justice, 38, 6, 1160 to 1166. https://doy-org.easy-proxy1-80-1016/j-crimjust 2010-09-004. Google Scholar. Beauregard E. Field J. 2008. Body Disposal Patterns of Sexual Murderers. Implications for Offender Profiling. Journal of Police and Criminal Psychology 23 2 81 to 89. https://doi-org easyproxy1.acus.edu/1007/S1189.
diagnosis of 71 cases in central Italy.
Alessandro Marotabon, Julia Secabelli, Georgia Piazzi, Raimondo Vela,
Alessandro Marotabon, Julia Secabelli, Georgia Piazzi, Raimondo Vela.
Alessandro Marotabon, Julia Secabelli, Georgia Piazzi, Raimondo Vela. Abstract. Overkill is characterized by the finding of excessive wounds on the victim's body. Despite the large use of this term, it does not have a definition in the literature yet. Our study aimed to analyze the information related to the dynamics of overkill cases, collecting objective variables, and producing a profile of the players involved in this type of homicides. Data on 71 overkill cases from reports of the autopsies performed in the section of legal medicine of the University of Rome Tor Vergata from January 1st, 2000 to December 31st, 2020 were collected. The victims and the perpetrators of overkill shared similar characteristics. They were usually male-aged between 20 and 50 years, more likely in the 20 to 35 years range. Victims, however, also showed another age peak in the range 50 to 55 years. The type of damage can be linked to the sole action of a cold weapon or the simultaneous use of multiple harmful tools with no significant differences. The most common motive proved to be a dispute for feudal reasons. However, in the case of a single perpetrator of the crime, the economic and passionate motives are as frequent as the previous one. Implications of the findings and avenues for future research are discussed. Keywords: forensic pathology, forensic anthropology, overkill, homicide, victim-offender relationship, violence, offender profiling, victim profiling, injury quantification. 1. Introduction. Control of interpersonal violence is one of the fundamental tasks of the society. Homicide represents the most serious consequence of violence. The social interest, sometimes more important than the legal one, lies in the fact that homicide represents the destruction of a greater good. Homicide can operate on the emotional sphere of people, and for this reason, it has constantly stimulated the search for the prominent traits of criminal personality and for the motivations behind it, focusing each time on the social conditions and the prior events, pathological and non-pathological. These research produced a series of theories on violent and criminal behavior, which highlighted how often homicides arose from hidden and unconscious motivations. Even traditionally, the reasons behind them were included in the classes of rational homicides, explainable on the basis of profit, small social condition, and as emotional homicides interpretable on the basis of jealousy, resentment, revenge, or the defense of one's own honor, the so-called anti-passion. For this reason, the suppression of interpersonal violence cannot ignore the understanding of the underlying structures that generate violence, and therefore keeping track of the epidemiology of violence is a necessity. A particular type of homicide is represented by the so-called overkill, which is characterized by the finding of excessive wounds on the victim's body.
Although the term is often used in the literature, it does not have a specific definition. The one which most authors refer to is the definition given by Wrestler, Douglas, and Jesus, according to which overkill consists of the infliction of more injury than necessary to kill a person. Jordan et al. Defined overkill as the infliction of multiple wounds to one body area or multiple wounds across many body areas, allowing researchers to code injury severity based on the brutality of the attacker rather than the extent of damage to the victim. Tamsin Levin and Thuglin, on the other hand, believed that overkill could be differently identified depending on the number and location of the wounds, in relation to the type of injury. 1. A total of 40 or more skin injuries. 2. 3 or more sharp wounds located at the head, neck, or trunk with internal organ injuries. 3. 3 or more gunshot wounds located at the head, neck, or trunk with internal organ injuries. Despite the absence of an exact definition of overkill, attempts to assess injury in general and particularly in cases of overkill have been made over the years. The usefulness of a quantitative analysis on homicide injuries is the possibility to summarize a group of offenders' behaviors reduction, sexual offenders thus facilitating police investigations. They may also be useful in illustrating the nature of a violent crime and the dynamics of the interaction between the offender and victim. This dynamic is known in the law enforcement community where, anecdotally, the level of injury and the location of those injuries on the body have implied some level of existing relationship. The appropriate classification of injuries by type and severity is fundamental to the study of injury etiology. Scales for categorizing injuries are grouped into two types, those that assess the physiological status and those that describe the injury in terms of anatomical location, specific lesion, and relative severity. The most important classification for our study is the homicide injury scale that was developed to capture the overkill features or excessive injuries on the victims. Overkill features, for this purpose based on the multiple examples given by Douglas et al. Are classified as a score of 5 or 6, as shown in Table 1. This is an alternative measure to the classical scores, proffered for the purpose of providing a quantitative standard measure of the degree of injury. Delineating the nature of the injuries may prove more useful in differentiating offender variables. The need for differentiation and, therefore, more specificity and accuracy in victim injury analysis is what led to the development of a scheme for measuring homicidal injuries that is. This measure can be used to compare injuries across a large sample of cases for which different and multiple causes of death and attendant levels of injury exist. His attempts to further capture the qualitative element of a victim's fatal injuries in a quantitative manner. This is accomplished by quantifying the severity of only those injuries that are directly related to the cause of death through the command. Repeating the medical examiner's autopsy report and related protocols. Following this scheme, it is responsible to capture the number of causes of death and related injury severity as identified by a medical examiner. Proposed values and intended interpretations for this are shown in the overmentioned table. Overkill is an example of forensic finding that will often lead the investigator to a specific homicide category and, thus, a possible motive for the offense. Hence, the medical examiner and investigators have an essential role in evaluating not only the number of injuries, but also their distribution, morphology, and the work that needs to improve them. To obtain a classification in a single specific case, it is mandatory to uniquely identify the presence or absence of the overkill. According to Georgia, Southgate, and Shines, the lack of a concrete and objective definition of overkill impedes proper operationalization of the term and complicates replication across studies and the direct comparison of results, therefore limiting our ability to empirically determine its full utility and application. In addition to the classic, more objective, and quantifiable characteristics within a crime scene reduction, number and locations of hits, simultaneous use of multiple means many variables are reported in the literature to identify overkill. Even cases with a single wound were somehow classified as overkill, whereas nearly complete penetration of the weapon including the handle into the body of the victim was recorded. According to some other authors, other examples of overkill could be the following: a victim subsequently beaten with a blunt object to leave impressions all over the head, a wound with blood lesions on the cranium associated with several stabs in the neck and thorax, as well as victims shot twice in the head. Person in which way suggested that victims' level of resistance to an attack may contribute to the level of violence in the homicide, and therefore the action of the victim should be considered and suspected in overkill. Another critical issue that has been raised is whether the definition of overkill should consider that if the murderer is aware of committing an extremely violent act, that is, inflicting on the victim more wounds than necessary to kill, or if the perpetrator of such a crime is driven by a strong emotional state, such as anger or loss of control. In fact, if awareness becomes a necessary requirement for the definition, this can prove problematic when the murderer acts in an intensified emotional state and is therefore not aware of inflicting an excessive number of wounds on the victim. In this regard, an article sustained that some organized murders perpetrated overkill to prevent the identification of the victim's identity. According to Kimball et al., probably the perpetrator who overkills is aimed to have complete control and domination over the victim. Interestingly, the author also associated perversion with the overkill as a paraphilia in the form of sadism consisting in the sexual interest in penetrating the skin of another person, sometimes enough to cause the death. The importance of the relationship between victim and offender seems debated. Douglas et al. Stated, the more evidence there is of overkill, the closer the relationship is between the victim and the offender. Investigators that
that was hard.
They should have concentrated their investigation on those known to the victim, while empirical studies demonstrate that excessive injuries were not related to offenders, but to relational categories. For many authors, the use of variable with clear, objective, and observable definitions should be preferred to the descriptions of subjective ones and focused on the internal motivation of the offenders, that may be open to personal interpretation. This led to different trends in the empirical homicide literature, in which overkill was examined as a distinct variable of crime scene investigation versus the use of simpler, but more objective concepts, such as the number of inflicted wounds, having more difficulties in operationalizing the term. Our study aims to analyze the information relating to the dynamics of the overkill cases present in the records of the section of legal medicine of the University of Rome Tor Vergata, collecting objective variables and producing a profile of the characteristics of the victims and perpetrators most involved in this type of homicides. 2 materials and methods. A retrospective analysis of all autopsy reports performed in the section of legal medicine of the University of Rome Tor Vergata from January 1st, 2000 to December 31st, 2020 was conducted. After a first screening, all non-homicide reports were discarded. For single case eligibility, the following inclusion criterion was adopted: reports about cases of overkill, defined by at least one of the 3 definitions given above, as suggested by Jordan. During the study period, a total of 153 homicide cases were autopsied and only 71 cases fitting our criterion were selected. A data extraction sheet was developed, and for each single case the following items were recorded: details of the victims and autoptic findings, details of the perpetrator. It is important to note that for cases in which one victim had more than one perpetrator, or perpetrator remained unknown, or one perpetrator killed more than one victim were properly recorded, and a single extraction sheet was made for each individual. For each feature, a descriptive analysis was performed using software SPSS 26. Data were also divided considering if the murders were committed by one, or more, or unknown perpetrator. Finally, we analyzed the cases by considering 4 categories. 1. All cases. 2. Single perpetrator. 3. Multi-perpetrator. 4. Perpetrator unknown. For the qualitative variables, absolute percentages and frequencies were calculated. Quantitative variables were investigated by the mean values and the standard deviation. 3 results. The results of statistical analysis are summarized in the following tables and graphically shown in figures 1 and 2. 3.1 victims. Among the 71 cases that were analyzed, the total number of victims was 73, because of the presence of 2 cases of double homicide. In addition, 41 cases presented only 1 murderer. 3.2 perpetrators. In 18 cases there was more than 1 perpetrator of the crime, for a total of 52 perpetrators. In 12 cases, no information on the perpetrator was available. The total number of perpetrators identified was therefore 93 in a total of 59 cases. For 3 of the 93 identified perpetrators, all of whom involved in the same homicide, it was impossible to find information about sex and age. For discussion. The analysis of the data deriving from the forensic work, through a careful examination of the victim's body and the crime scene, integrated with circumstantial data of the methodologies and dynamics of the killing, are considered fundamental in the definition of criminal profiles and personality characteristics of the offender in order to direct police investigations. Although overkill has aroused the interest of many authors in the last 20 years, its investigation cannot be considered exhausted yet, as proved by the heterogeneity of the definitions suggested over the years. Being an extremely complex and diversified entity, the approach to overkill cannot leave out of consideration the record of all the characteristics of the actors, which are not only limited to the harmful patterns and the tools used, but includes the analysis of the relationships, motivations, contexts, and all the circumstantial data. A type of killing characterized by extreme violence, such as overkill, tends to manifest itself in specific geopolitical and socio-cultural contexts. For some authors, homosexuals, but also subjects belonging to ethnic minorities, constitute a category of subjects particularly at risk for an overkill. This is especially true for subjects who most frequently indulge in casual relationships and with strangers. According to Bell and Vila, from the comparison between homicides among homosexuals and heterosexuals, a clear prevalence of overkill was noted in the formers. Among our cases, there were 4 homosexual male victims. According to Zara et al., another category at risk for violent murder is represented by prostitutes, especially when the connection with the murderer was not limited to the sole relationship of customer/service provider but was of a more intimate nature. In our records, as well, there were 3 cases with prostitutes among the victims. In 2 of these cases, the motive was of a crime of passion. The killers were respectively the victim's boyfriend and a regular customer. In the 3rd case, the motive was of an economic nature, as the regular customer refused to pay the woman. Other particular socio-cultural contexts are those highlighted by Toprak and Ersoy, who argued that 1 in 3 femicides in Turkey had the characteristics of an overkill. Adinkra described the use of excessive violence in the murders perpetrated by young Ghanaians against their grandmothers, whom they accused of witchcraft and of having been responsible for their problems, to be mostly the result of an economic and/or physical motive, with the goal of annihilating the witch and recovering the lost well-being. It should also be noted that 21 victims and 35 perpetrators among those identified in our cases were immigrants. As highlighted by Potenza et al. About feminicide including, though a broader definition than the Who's One, any killing of women or girls contrary to what may seem from the frequency and animosity of public opinion debates and from the media, which report a steady increase in the number of women murders, these events do not seem to be an emerging phenomenon of recent years but, in accordance with national statistical data, they remain stable. In our cases, only 18 out of 73 victims were women, indicating that the increase of violence and overkill was not related to gender violence and feminicide. An emerging problem comes from the world of online relationships, where victims are killed during their first meeting by a person met via social networks. These killings were usually characterized by a high number of wounds mainly caused by cold weapons, distributed on various parts of the body, many of whom on the chest and, sometimes, by mutilation. In our records, this was the case for one of the murders of a homosexual, in which the victim and the killer had met through social media, and the homicide was committed at the end of their first date, when the murderer tried to rob the victim. Another important relationship to be considered is the one between overkill and the psychiatric pathologies of the killers. A study by Logisallo and Hawkinen analyzed 125 murders committed by subjects suffering from schizophrenia. In 37 cases there was excessive use of violence, especially in cases that occurred in the family, as also confirmed by Kondo and Oshima. In the latter type of homicides, the level of violence was extreme, as in the case of a son with schizophrenia who killed his mother with 85 stabs on the face, limbs, chest, and abdomen, and finally decapitated her. Among our cases, 5 offenders were affected by a psychiatric pathology, 4 of whom by a psychotic disorder with delusions and hallucinations, and 1 with an attention disorder with hyperactivity associated with a learning disorder. Although psychotic disorders seem to be the most frequent ones, it is also possible to find associations between overkill and personality disorders, in whom the behavior of the perpetrator is in their mind justified by the interpretation they have of the relationship with others, who are turned into inanimate entities, whose sacrifice is justified by the achievement of the interests of the killer, in the absence of guilt. Finally, a case of homicide-suicide present in our records opened to interesting psychodynamic considerations. A woman, a medical oncologist, received continuous proposals and invitations from the son of one of her patients, who had had fantasies about the possibility of a romantic relationship between them, misunderstanding the availability derived from her working role. After numerous refusals, the man waited for the doctor in the hospital parking lot and then killed her by stabbing her 25 times. Once back home, he took his own life by strangling himself with 2 electrical cable wires. In this case, 2 different distinctive traits emerged. On one hand, a lack in controlling the aggressive, irrepressible impulse, deriving from anger due to rejection, to which other people would have responded in a more adequate and understandable way. This characteristic, according to Andrensen and Black, is notoriously associated with violent behaviors. On the other hand, given the brutality, but above all the self-incrimination expressed in this case by the suicide, are the distinctive traits of the depressed man. This theory, however, deviates from the classic interpretation made by Dalmas, in which the depressed person, who is trapped in a narrow, hostile space of life, with no way out and no future prospects, decides to take his own life and to take it away from the dearest person, who is, in the mind of the perpetrator, also caged in an unsustainable existential condition. Concerning the wounds and the weapons used, it should be noted that in many cases more than one harmful tool was used, almost always represented by the combination of cold weapons and blunt tools. However, the use of cold weapons appeared predominant, especially if compared with that of firearms. These data were not surprising given that the killings of the research sample occurred in Italy, where the possession of firearms is limited by law, and there are only 6 cases in the literature. This trend is also confirmed by the international literature, as we can only find one article that reports 2 murders, occurred in Canada and perpetrated with the use of firearms, committed by the same killer and with the same weapon, which were categorized by the authors as overkill. Lastly, in 8 cases the perpetrators set the body on fire after committing the overkill. This similar circumstance appears to be uncommon in the literature as it is only found in another case. It is also important to consider the use of the so-called weapons of opportunity, i.e., a commonly used tool that can be used as a weapon, if necessary. In our records, as well, there were cases with these characteristics, tools, always used in combination with others, such as sticks, iron bars, and in one case, a plastic tube used to strangle the victim. This case, which according to our previous work was the most common among the overkill cases, would seem to play an important role in transforming an aggressive impulse, which would otherwise end in a less serious criminal offense, into a violent homicide, favoring the interpretation that these homicides represent an involuntary outcome, or at least not premeditated, resulting from an impulsive and uncontrollable reaction, which in the absence of favorable circumstances, would not have materialized. 5 conclusions. Based on the frequencies that emerged from our analysis, it is possible to reconstruct a profile of the most common characteristics of the victims, perpetrators, and their modus operandi. 5.1 Profile of the victim. The victim of overkill cases was usually a male adult aged between 20 and 35 years, or between 50 and 55 years. The number of wounds on the body was usually remarkable, an average of 18, and they are typically localized in the chest and upper limbs, probably as a result of defense. The type of damage could be linked to the sole action of a cold weapon or the simultaneous use of multiple harmful tools with no significant differences. With a similar percentage, the victim's body was usually found inside their home or on the street. 5.2 Profile of the perpetrator. In more than 90% of the cases, the perpetrator of an overkill was an adult aged between 20 and 50, more likely in the 20 to 35 range. If more than one person was involved in the murder, they were usually acquaintances/friends of the victim. When the crime was committed by a single person, there was a significant increase in family or sentimental relationships between the killer and the victim. When the perpetrator and the victim were strangers, the action was usually committed in a group, and it was linked to mafia or criminal clans activities. The most common proved to be a dispute for feudal reasons. However, in the case of a single perpetrator of the crime, the economic and passionate motives were as frequent as the previous one. Author contributions: conceptualization, AMT, GC, GP, GP, and GLM, methodology, GLM, and AC, validation, GP, AMT, and GG, formal analysis, AMT, GP, and RB, investigation, GC, GG, and RB, resources, GP, and AMT, data curation, GC, and GP, writing original draft preparation, AMT, GC, and GP, writing review and editing, GP and RB, visualization, GC, and GP, supervision, GLM, and AC, project administration, AMT, and GP. All authors have read and agreed to the published version of the manuscript. Funding. This research received no external funding. Institutional Review Board Statement, not applicable. Informed Consent Statement, not applicable. Data Availability Statement, data available on request due to restrictions, example privacy, or ethical. The data presented in this study are available on request
And
from the
Pokemon
corresponding
cannot
author.
forget the H.
Conflicts of interest. The authors declare no conflict of interest. References. 1 Tamsin, F. Stirrup, J. Thiblin, I. Homicide injury severity in association with the victim-offender relationship. Forensics IINT 2019, 300, 151 to 156. Tumarello, G.L., Liviero, V. Giusti, G. Overkill. River Italian Medleg. 1998, 20, 435 to 472. 3 Wrestler, R.K., Douglas, J.E., Burgess, A.W. Sexual Homicide, Patterns and Motives, The Free Press, New York, USA, 1995, p. 55. Gore Jordan, C. Pritchard, A.J., Duckett, D. Wilcox, P. Corey, T. Combest, M. Relationship and Injury Trends in the Homicide of Women Across the Lifespan, a research note. Homicide Stud. 2010, 14, 181 to 192. 5 Tamsin, F. Logan, F.K., Thiblin, I. Homicide Injury Quantification, Correlations and Reliability of Injury Severity Scores Applied to Homicide Victims. Homicide Stud. 2015, 19, 88 to 100. 6 Safari, M.E., Jarvis, J.P. Examining Attributes of Homicides. Homicide Stud. 2005, 9, 183 to 203. 7 The Birth. BJ Practical Homicide Investigation, Tactics, Procedures, and Forensic Techniques, 3rd ed. CRC Press, Boca Raton, Florida, USA, 1996. 8 Wrestler, RK, Burgess, AW, Douglas, J. Sexual Homicide, Patterns and Motives, Lexington Books, Lexington Mom, USA, 1988. 9 Safari, Emmy, Jarvis, Jakey, Roosevelt, Katie Elderly Female Serial Sexual Homicide, Eliminated Empirical Test of Criminal Investigative Analysis. Homicide Stud, 2004, 294 to 307. 10 Safari, Emmy, Jarvis, Jakey, Roosevelt, Katie Sexual Homicide of Elderly Females, Linking Offender Characteristics to Victim and Crime Scene Attributes. Violence 2017, 500 to 525. Olympic Association for the Advancement of Automotive Medicine. Available on September 5th, 2022. 12 Batistella, 50, 10 p.m. Arrest, trauma patients 75 years and older. Long-term follow-up results justify aggressive management. J. Trauma 1988, 44, 600, and 18 to 624. 13 Stoner, HB, Harden, RN, Little, RA, Yates, DW measuring the severity of injury. PR Benji 1977, 2, 1247 to 1249. 14 Douglas, J. Burgess, BW, Burgess, HE, Wrestler, RK Crime Classification Manual, a standard system for investigating and classifying violent crimes. John Wiley and Sons, San Francisco Seal, USA, 1992. 13 Wrestler, RK, Douglas, J. Burgess, BW, Armin, CR, D'Agostino, RB sexual killers and their victims, identifying patterns through crime scene analysis. J. Interpers, Violence 1986, 1, 288 to 308. 16 Trojan, C, Salvating, CG, Shams, K Overkill, we know it when we see it, examining definitions of excessive injury in homicide research. JCRIM Cycle 2019, 9, 61 to 74. 17 L, W, Navarro, B, T, are homicides by sharp force with nearly complete penetration of the weapon. Arch Criminal, 2009, 223, 36 to 44. 18 Keppel, RD signature murders, a report of several related cases. J. Forensic Psi 1995, 40, 600, and 70 to 674. 19 Navarro, Urban, are overkill in the case of neonaticide. Arch Criminal, 2004, 213, 129 to 137. 20 Keppel, RD signature murders, a report of the 1984 Granville, British Columbia cases. J. Forensic Psi 2000, 45, 500
This motherfucker looks scary.
21%.
Oh god, my jewelry!
Life experience, the role of victim reaction in attempted homicide. J. Interpers, Violence 2001, 16, 600, and 79 to 696. 22 Vertigo. MM does the organized sexual murder a better delay and avoid detection. J. Interpers, Violence 2016, 31, 4 to 25. 23 Keppel, Hardy, Weiss, JG, Brown, KM, Welch, K. The Jack the Ripper murders, a modus operandi and signature analysis of the 1888 to 1891 Whitechapel murders. J. Investing, Cycle. Offender Profile, 2005, 2, 1 to 21. 24 Douglas, J. Munn, see Violent Crime Scene Analysis, Modus Operandi, Signature, and Staging. FBI law enforcement. Bold. 1992, 61, 1. 25 Trojan, C. Pro, AC variations in wounding by relationship intimacy in homicide cases. J. Interpreters. Violence 2012, 27, 2869 to 2888. 26 Baby, AR, South Africa, genetic examination of behavioral consistency using individual behaviors or groups of behaviors in serial homicide. Bihar. Psy Law 2007, 25, 527 to 544. 27 Cantor, TV, Allison, LJ, Allison, E, Wenting, N. The organized/disorganized typology of serial murder, hit or model. All Public Policy Law 2004, 10, 293 to 320. 28 Cantor, T, Wenting, N. An empirical test of homes and home serial murder typology. CRIL Justice
Fire time.
2004, 31, 489 to 514. 29 Puccini, C. Sigignani, A. Romanelli, M. Studi Salamasinio, Bologna, Italy, 1992, pp 1 to 128. ISBN -13978884910540. 30 Douglas, J. Bressler, R.K., Burgess, A.W., Mortman, CR Criminal Profiling from Crime Scene Analysis. Bihar. Psy Law 1986.
Oh, Butterfree, just
1 to 420.
Just upgrade real quick.
30 Wonderless, DG Hate Crimes Against Gay Males, an overview. Issue 10. Toughness. 2004, 25, 115 to 152.
Oh, so cute. But I know what you are, and I know what you evolve into. So that being said,
perpetrated by far-right extremists.
I'm gonna change my Pokemon. I'm gonna fight you. But I got a pretty good team on my hands right about now. Don't need
some criminological reflections. Rex. Italian criminal. 2013, 3, 192 to 199. 34 Nicolici, S. Zipcop IC. Multiple sharp force injuries to the head and ground of passion. SRPR. Cello. Blood. 2015,
I want to see how this charge me.
24 to 499. 35 Rado GIC and Gravisi.
I don't see no charge me.
Yes. Mulchin. M. Kuro EC.
I made a mistake at president.
Has multiple stabbing and sex-related homicides. J. Forensic Lab. Med 2013, 500, and 2 to 507. 36 Bell, MD, Mila, RI Homicide and Homicide.
I bet you I gotta read about what all this is about.
Abstract. This study investigates the role of sexual sadism in the crime commission process of sexual homicide, SH, involving child victims. The comparison between sadistic and non-sadistic cases involving child victims is conducted by examining the crime context, crime characteristics, methods of killing, body recovery characteristics, and forensic awareness strategies used by offenders. The sample comes from the Sexual Homicide International Database, SHID, including 135 cases of solved SHs involving child victims, 35 cases with sexual sadism, and 101 cases without sexual sadism. The Sexual Homicide Crime Scene Rating Scale for Sexual Sadism, SADSEX-SH, scale is used to identify sexual sadism from crime scene actions. By Bivariate and multivariate analysis are performed to examine the differences between the two groups. Findings indicate that sadistic SH of children are characterized by an important level of structured premeditation, the commission of more diversified sexual acts, the use of specific method of killing, and the partial use of forensic awareness strategies. Practical implications in terms of criminal investigations are discussed. Introduction. Gilles de Rais, a French nobleman living in the 15th century, is known to have tortured and killed hundreds of children to obtain sexual gratification. He is often considered as the first sadistic sexual homicide offender, SHO, of children. In the 19th century, Fritz Haarmann, also known as the Ogre of Hanover, murdered numerous young boys. He reported obtaining sexual pleasure by ripping the throat of his young victims and mutilating them. Holmes, 1983. Holmes and de Bergen, 1985. Sadistic sexual homicide, SH, of children is a rare, unusual, and horrible event. However, despite these gruesome characteristics and what appear to be irrational motivations, this type of crime was never empirically studied. Knowledge on this particular form of SH comes mainly from the sadistic SH of adult victims. Empirical research on child SH has been non-existent, and cases involving child victims were included with cases involving adult victims. For a review, see Chopin and Beauregard, 2019b, 2019c. More recently, an emergence of empirical studies demonstrated that child SH constituted a specific form of offending with a distinct crime commission process. Beauregard et al., 2008, Chopin and Beauregard, 2019c, Firestone et al., 1998, Gratzer and Bradford, 1995, Prue et al., 2007, 2018, Schmidt and Medea, 1999. To further investigate the heterogeneity of SH, Chopin and Beauregard, 2019c, were the first to empirically identify a classification specific to SH of children. In continuity with this line of research, this study aims to examine the role of sexual sadism in SH of children. SH of children. Although these findings are informative, very few studies have examined the phenomena of SH of children. To show the distinct aspects of SH against children, some researchers compared sexual murderers of children to diverse groups of sex offenders. In terms of offender characteristics, these studies have shown that SHO of children exhibited more antisocial personality disorders, deviant sexual fantasies, and paraphilias, were more likely to receive 3 or more diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, 3rd edition, Rev. DSM-3R, American Psychiatric Association, APA, 1987, diagnoses, and demonstrated higher levels of deviant arousal in pedophilic and adult assault stimuli, Firestone et al., 1998, Gratzer and Bradford, 1995. Prue et al., 2007, Schmidt and Medea, 1999. However, SHOs of children were less likely to report alcohol abuse and drug dependency, as well as to present sexual dysfunctions or a narcissistic personality disorder. Spare et al., 2010. The SHOs of children have been described as stressed individuals who feel rejected and have low self-esteem. Beauregard et al., 2008. They are also more likely to use pornography prior to the crime and to plan the crime, compared with SHOs of adults, Beauregard et al., 2008. In addition, SHOs of children were more likely to establish contact with the victim prior to the crime, to commit the crime during the day, to use strangulation to kill the victim, and to dismember and hide the victim's body. As compared with SHOs of adults, Beauregard et al., 2008. Furthermore, SHOs of children were more likely to find the victim at home or outside on the street, and to physically beat the victim during the criminal event. Beauregard and Martineau, 2015. A study conducted by Prue et al., 2018, showed that SHOs of children were more likely to use physical violence to control the victim kill the victim for the purpose of eliminating a witness, and to commit the crime outdoors. SHOs of children were less likely to exhibit a structured premeditation, to pre-select the crime site and body dump site, to use restraints, to kidnap and confine the victim, to humiliate the victim, to use expressive violence as well as to use torture, compared with the SHOs of adult victims. Prue et al., 2018. Moreover, SHOs of children were less likely to commit a crime that occurred over a longer duration or use physical violence or kill the victim out of anger. Prue et al., 2018. Scott, 2019, compared 8 SHOs of children with 89 SHOs of adults and 176 non-sexual child homicide offenders. Analysis of SHO characteristics and modus operandi showed that SHOs of children were more similar to SHOs of adult victims than non-sexual homicide offenders and SHO of children. Lanning, 1994, suggested that in addition to the definitional problem of what constitutes a child, the discussion of SH of children has been obscured by the fact that SHOs of children appear to be a diverse population of offenders. Lanning, 1994, further explained that the violence used in SH can take different forms and proposed a theoretical classification. A. Inadvertent, i.e., killing for a lack of care. B. Indiscriminate, i.e., killing if necessary. And C. Intentional, i.e., varied categories including sadists, killing to avoid detection, misguided love from a pedophile or ambivalent hate. Chopin and Beauregard, 2019C, were the first to propose a first empirical classification of SH against children with 72 cases from France. They identified a 6-cluster typology based on Lanning's 1994 level of violence, as well as the age category. The first type was labeled as the intentional/prepubescent, where offenders usually select very young male victims, and they typically anally penetrate them. They kill victims to avoid detection and move the victim's body from the crime scene following the murder. Offenders of this category are relatively young, do not suffer from social isolation, and consumed alcohol and or drugs at the time of the offense. The inadvertent/prepubescent is characterized by young offenders targeting very young victims who are mostly male. Offenders from this category are mostly single. They are not socially isolated, and they generally have not engaged in previous criminal activities. However, their behavior is very violent, as these offenders are characterized by beating the victim and performing unusual acts. They do not typically penetrate the victim, but instead fondle the victim, as well as inflict some sadistic acts. The crime scene is never a residence, and in most cases, victims are killed by strangulation. Offenders of intentional/preteen category present a high prevalence of alcohol and or drug consumption during the criminal event, similar to the intentional/prepubescent category. This category of SH is mainly characterized by the diversity of sexual acts committed, as well as the presence of sadism. These offenders typically use a ruse to approach the victim, and they are generally familiar with the crime scene, which is most often not a residence. The inadvertent/preteen category of offenders exclusively targets female preteen victims. These offenders are particularly violent with their victim, but the sexual acts committed appear as less sadistic and less humiliating than previous category. However, one of the most distinguishable features of this modus operandi is the use of a coercive approach by offenders to assault their victims. Offenders from the intentional/teen category only target female teenagers and have perpetrated sexual penetration of the victim, acts of sexual sadism, as well as using strangulation to kill the victim. In these SHs, the offender and the victim are complete strangers, but the offender uses a ruse to approach the victim. These offenders always commit their crime in residence, but are never familiar with the crime location. Offenders from the indiscriminate/teen category are the oldest, and they target the oldest female child victims. These SHs are characterized by the absence of sadism and humiliation, the presence of the vaginal penetration of the victim, and the use of strangulation to kill the victim. Another distinguishable feature of these SHs is related to the criminal career of the offenders. Chopin and Beauregard, 2019C, observed that 2/3 of them were frequently engaged in a variety of criminal activities, similar to the versatile sex offender identified by Beauregard et al., 2018. This criminal experience could also be related to the fact that all offenders have moved the victims' bodies after the murder, which is a strategy developed by experienced offenders to avoid being detected by the police, Beauregard, and Martin. 2015. SH of adult victims and sadism. In his book Psychopathia Sexualis, Kraft Ebbe, 1886, described the sadistic offender as an individual driven by the experience of pleasure, which could only be achieved through means of cruelty and corporal punishment on animals or people. Since then, multiple efforts by researchers and clinicians have been made to validate the notion of sadism. Despite some difficulties in reaching an agreed-upon definition, it seems that there exists a general consensus as to the sexual arousal of sexual sadists, whether it is A. some form of violent or humiliating behavior, e.g., Abel. 1989, Roth and Birnbaum, 1978, Knight et al., 1994, Knight and Prentke, 1990. B. The victim's reaction to this behavior, e.g., being frightened, scared, or being in pain. Marshall and Kennedy, 2003. Or C. The resulting feeling of power and control as a result of it. Violence inflicted. Britain, 1970. Dietz et al., 1990. Rubin, 1994. McCulloch et al., 1983. Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. 5th edition. DSM-5, APA 2013, defines sadism as recurrent and intense sexual arousal from the physical or psychological suffering of another person, as manifested by fantasies, urges, or behaviors. Page 694. Furthermore, the DSM-5 requires that these urges, fantasies, and behaviors are acted onto a non-consenting individual. Others have argued that sadists can be characterized by a deviant sexual preference for violence. Abel, 1989. Roth and Birnbaum, 1978. Knight et al., 1994. Knight and Prentke, 1990. However, researchers like Grotzer and Bradford, 1995, have suggested that violence is not a sufficient condition to elicit sexual arousal, but the control of another person through domination, degradation, or infliction of pain for the purpose of sexual pleasure, page 50. According to this perspective, it is not so much the violence, but the humiliation, degradation, subjugation, and suffering producing fear, terror, pain, and panic in the victim, which makes the sadist feel powerful and sexually aroused. Although most researchers have reached a consensus on the main features associated with sexual sadism, there are still some methodological issues related to the measurement of sadism. Consequently, diagnosing sadism is still challenging today, and it has led to various estimates on the actual prevalence of this disorder. Depending on the study, it ranges anywhere from 5% to 50% of all sexual offenders. Barbary et al., 1994. Roth and Birnbaum, 1978. Perensky et al., 2012. Prue et al., 1999. In a recent estimate, sadism has been detected in approximately 35% of SHs. Hill et al., 2007. Although most existing scales that used to measure sadism require